Noah Williams learned early on that life has no mercy for those born with nothing. Growing up on the streets, with no family, no protection, and no future in sight, he knew the only rule that mattered was survival. But for a brief moment, everything felt different. Sophia Lancaster was the daughter of the most powerful man in the city. Raised in a world of wealth and privilege, she was never supposed to notice someone like Noah, but she did. And against all odds, a forbidden, fragile, and intense connection was formed, a bond that should have never existed. But fate and the ambition of Richard Lancaster, the ruthless patriarch of the Lancaster family, made sure it wouldn't last. Noah vanished without explanation, ripped from Sophia's life as if he had never existed. 7 years later, Sophia has become a relentless journalist, determined to expose the truths the elite want to keep hidden. And in her relentless pursuit of justice, she stumbles upon a name that should have been buried in the past: Noah Williams. But when she finally finds him, he is nothing like the boy she once knew. Noah is now a man shaped by secrets she never could have imagined. What happened to him during those lost years? Why did her father secretly fund his education? And most importantly, why does Noah seem like he doesn't want to be found? The past may have been left behind, but buried secrets always find their way back to the surface. And when the truth is finally revealed, no one will be left unscathed. Now tell me, where are you watching from? Noah moved quickly, his small frame slipping through the narrow alleyways like a shadow. He had mastered the art of being unnoticed, staying close to the walls, keeping his footsteps light, never drawing attention. The city saw him, but chose not to. A boy like him, skin dark as the night, clothes too, big and frayed at the edges, was nothing more than background noise in a world that had already decided he didn't matter. He had learned to live with it. It was safer this way. But tonight, as he huddled beneath the awning of a closed bakery, shivering in his damp hoodie, something unusual caught his eye. A girl sitting on the curb, her blonde hair gleaming under the dim streetlights. She was out of place in every possible way. Her dress, though slightly wrinkled, was expensive, the kind that belonged in grand houses and lavish parties, not on the filthy sidewalk where her polished shoes barely touched the ground. She held a piece of bread in her small hands, turning it over as if deciding what to do with it. Noah's stomach twisted at the sight. Hunger was an old companion, gnawing at his ribs, whispering in his ear. But he had rules. Never take risks he couldn't escape from. Yet, the girl wasn't moving, wasn't eating, wasn't running. She just sat there, her large blue-gray eyes staring into the distance, as if lost in a world he couldn't see. He took a step closer, barely aware that his usual instinct to flee was momentarily forgotten. She noticed him, not in the way most people did, with quick, uncomfortable glances before looking away, pretending he wasn't there. She saw him, her gaze locking onto his, as if he were just another kid, not a ghost, haunting the alleyways. Noah hesitated, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. This was wrong. Rich kids didn't belong here. They didn't sit on dirty curbs holding food they clearly weren't eating. His eyes flicked to the bread again. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she was waiting for someone. Maybe... His stomach twisted again. Maybe she was bait, a trap set by someone who knew that hunger could make boys like him reckless. The girl tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. Then, without hesitation, she extended the bread toward him. Noah didn't move, his body tensed, every nerve screaming at him to turn around and disappear. This was a test. It had to be. Nothing in his life had ever been freely given. He had learned that even kindness had a price, and it was often too steep to pay. His fingers twitched at his sides, itching to grab the food and run. But something in the way she held it, calm, deliberate, without pity, made him pause. She wasn't offering it the way people did when they wanted to feel good about themselves, when they handed scraps to the homeless and expected gratitude in return. "You're hungry," she said, her voice steady, not a question, but a statement. The way she said it was strange, like she understood hunger, like it wasn't just something she had read about in a book. Noah's throat was dry. He hadn't spoken to anyone properly in days. Words felt foreign on his tongue, but he forced himself to speak. "Who are you?" The girl blinked as if the question had caught her off guard. She glanced down at the bread in her hands, then back at him, before answering simply, "Sophia." Noah waited, expecting more. Last names, explanations, something to tell him why she was here. But she just held out the bread again, as if that was the only answer that mattered. Noah's fingers twitched again, but he still didn't move. The rules were clear. Nothing was free. And yet, there was no one else around. No angry adults waiting in the shadows to pounce on him. No threats disguised as charity. Just this girl, sitting on the curb, offering him something he needed more than anything. Hunger won out over caution. Slowly, he reached forward, snatching the bread from her hand before taking a step back, muscles coiled, ready to bolt. But Sophia didn't flinch. She didn't scold him for not saying thank you, didn't ask him where his parents were, didn't say anything at all. He bit into the bread. It was soft, fresh, nothing like the stale leftovers he usually found in dumpsters. His mind raced. Who was this girl? Why was she here? Why wasn't she afraid of him? He had seen people cross the street to avoid kids like him. He had heard mothers whisper to their children not to stare when he walked past. But Sophia looked at him like he wasn't something to be avoided, like he was normal. He swallowed, his voice rough when he finally spoke again. "Why are you here?" Sophia's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. A hesitation, a weight she wasn't sure she should share. Noah knew that look well. It was the same one he saw in his reflection when he caught glimpses of himself in shop windows, the look of someone who had lost something they couldn't get back. "I don't know," she admitted. And for the first time in a long time, Noah believed someone's words without question. Noah sat on the cracked concrete bench of the abandoned park, his fingers tightening around the sandwich in his hands. The bread was soft, the kind rich people ate, not the stale crusts he usually found in dumpsters. He had long stopped questioning where Sophia got the food. He only knew that every day at the same time she appeared, slipping past the iron gates like a ghost, always carrying something for him. At first, he had convinced himself it was pity. Rich girls did things like this, gave to the less fortunate to feel good about themselves. But Sophia never acted like she was saving him. She never asked him if he was okay, never tried to make him talk about his life. She just showed up, sat next to him, and shared her food as if they had always done this. Today was no different. She appeared between the rusted swings and the broken slide, her blonde hair still neat despite the dust that clung to her shoes. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near a boy like him, but she didn't seem to care. Noah watched as she placed a neatly wrapped piece of cake beside him, her blue-gray eyes scanning him as if making sure he was real. "You look tired," she noted, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. He smirked, tearing off a piece of the sandwich with his teeth. "And you look like you don't belong here," he shot back. Sophia shrugged. "Maybe I don't," she admitted, pulling her knees up to her chest. "But I like coming here." He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. It was obvious in the way she lingered after handing him food, in the way her fingers played with the hem of her dress when she thought he wasn't looking. She was running from something, just like him. The difference was, she had somewhere safe to go back to. Noah didn't. He let the silence stretch between them, finishing his meal in slow bites, making it last. She never rushed him, never made him feel like he had to prove he deserved the food. That was the strangest part. She acted like he belonged in her world, like he wasn't some dirty street kid she should be. Afraid of? For a while it was easy to believe the lie, that this was normal, that this would last. Until the day it didn't. The first sign that something was wrong was the absence of Sophia. She was never late. He told himself she had just been caught up in something. Maybe a lesson, maybe a family, a dinner she couldn't escape. But as the minutes dragged into hours, the weight in his chest grew heavier. Something was wrong. He knew better than to go looking for answers, but the itch under his skin wouldn't let him leave the park. Then he heard it, the heavy footsteps, the deliberate movements of men who didn't belong in abandoned places. His instincts screamed at him to run, but by the time he turned, it was too late. Two men in dark suits stepped forward, their expressions unreadable. Noah didn't have to ask who they were. He already knew. And then, the voice that made his stomach turn to ice. "You shouldn't have let her get attached." Richard Lancaster stood behind them, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to make people listen. His suit was crisp, his presence suffocating. This was Sophia's father. This was the man who had built an empire with money and fear. And now that cold, piercing gaze was fixed on Noah like he was a stain that needed to be erased. Noah forced himself to stay still, even as every muscle in his body begged him to run. "She has a habit of picking up strays," Richard continued, adjusting his cufflinks as if this conversation bored him. "It's a flaw I intend to correct." Noah clenched his fists, the last bite of the sandwich still on his tongue, turning to dust. He wanted to say something, to tell this man that Sophia wasn't some lost little girl who needed correcting. But before he could, Richard spoke again. "He won't come back." "Here," Richard ordered, his voice smooth, controlled. He didn't even look at Noah anymore. He didn't need to. He wasn't speaking to him. He was speaking about him, like he was an inconvenience that needed to be handled. His eyes flicked to his men, giving a small, dismissive nod. "Make him understand." Noah had seen enough to know what those words meant. His legs moved before his brain could catch up, instincts taking over. He darted past the first man, twisting away from the second before their hands could grab him. They were fast, but he was faster. Years of running had made him impossible to catch. He didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't breathe until the city swallowed him whole. By the time he finally stopped, his lungs burning, the weight of what had happened settled over him like a heavy fog. It was over. Whatever strange, fragile thing he and Sophia had built had been shattered in a matter of seconds. And yet, as he wiped his sleeve across his mouth and forced himself to keep moving, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Sophia wasn't done with him, and neither was he. Noah barely had time to react before rough hands shoved him against the brick wall. His shoulder hit first, sending a sharp jolt of pain down his arm, but he barely had a second to process it before another set of hands gripped his collar, pinning him in place. Two men, both wearing the same tailored suits, their expressions unreadable beneath the flickering street lamp. They weren't here to kill him. If they were, he'd already be dead. No, this was something else. A lesson, a warning. The kind of thing people like him didn't usually live long enough to forget. "You should have known." "Better," the taller one muttered, his grip tightening just enough to make Noah's breathing shallow. The other man, broader, his face carved with the kind of indifference that came from years of doing this, stepped closer. "Sophia Lancaster is not for you." His voice was quiet, the type of calm that made Noah's skin prickle. Not a threat, a fact. They weren't trying to scare him. They were letting him know how the world worked, as if he hadn't already learned that lesson 1,000 times over. Rich people stayed with rich people. Street kids disappeared. That was the way things had always been. Noah forced himself to keep his expression blank. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of fear, even as his ribs ached from the pressure of their grip. "I wasn't trying to be for her," he muttered, even though they both knew that wasn't the point. It didn't matter what he wanted. It didn't even matter what Sophia wanted. The fact that she had noticed him at all was enough to turn him into a problem. And problems, when they belonged to kids like him, didn't get solved. They got erased. The broader man sighed, shaking his head like he was disappointed, like Noah had made a mistake that could have been avoided if only he had known his place. "You don't belong in her world," he said, and this time there was no menace in his voice, just certainty. "Keep pushing, and you disappear." The words should have scared him, Maybe they did. But the thing about threats was that they only worked when someone had something to lose, and Noah had lost everything a long time ago. Still, he wasn't stupid. He knew when to play along. "Got it," he said, nodding just enough to make it seem like he understood. The taller man finally let go of his collar, stepping back, but before Noah could move, the broad one struck, a sharp blow to his stomach, calculated, controlled, just enough to double him over, but not enough to leave a lasting mark. Another to his ribs, quick and precise. Pain bloomed, sharp and bright, but Noah had been through worse. He staggered but stayed on his feet, refusing to give. Then the satisfaction of seeing him fall. They watched him for a moment, their work done, then turned without another word, disappearing down the alley as if nothing had happened. Noah stayed where he was, hands braced against his knees, breathing through the pain. He had two choices. He could listen, walk away, disappear like they wanted him to, or he could pretend none of this mattered and keep showing up, keep proving that he wouldn't be erased so easily. His ribs ached as he straightened, wiping his mouth with the back of his sleeve. He already knew what he was going to do. By the time he reached the park, the world had settled into its usual rhythm again. The swings still creaked from where they hung unused, the benches still cracked under years of neglect. And Sophia was there, waiting. The moment she saw him, her eyes widened, horror flashing across her face as she ran toward him. "Noah!" She reached for him, but he stepped back instinctively. She froze, her hands hovering in the space between them. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice too sharp, too full of something he didn't want to name. "Nothing," he said, forcing a smirk. He ignored the way his body screamed in protest, the way his ribs protested every breath. "I'm still alive." That should have been enough. It should have reassured her, but it didn't. Sophia's expression twisted, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "Who did this?" she whispered, and there was something dangerous in her voice, something that made Noah's stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the pain. She wasn't supposed to care. That was the whole point of this lesson. He was supposed to be invisible again, a momentary mistake corrected. But she wasn't looking away. She wasn't pretending this hadn't happened. And that was a problem, one far bigger than any warning her father's men could give. Sophia stormed into her father's office, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. Richard Lancaster barely looked up from his desk, his fingers flipping through a stack of neatly arranged documents, as if his daughter's fury was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. She knew better than to expect an outburst from him. Richard never raised his voice. He never needed to, but tonight she wasn't going to be ignored. "What did you do to him?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. She had spent the entire evening searching for Noah, waiting in the park long past when he should have appeared. And when he didn't, dread settled in her stomach like a stone. Richard finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Who?" he asked, though they both knew he already had the answer. Sophia's nails dug into her palms. "Noah!" she spat, her breath uneven. "He's gone. He never just disappears. Someone made him leave." She hated the way her voice cracked at the end, the way it made her sound younger, weaker. Richard's gaze was coldly amused, like she was an adorable child throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. "I assume you mean the street boy," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I warned you about getting attached to things that don't belong to you, Sophia." Her stomach twisted at his words, at the way he spoke about Noah like he wasn't even a person. "He's not a thing," she shot back, her voice trembling with anger. "He's my friend." Richard's lips curled into a knowing smile, the kind that made her feel small, like she had already lost before the battle had even begun. "You don't understand now," he said smoothly, pouring himself a drink as if this conversation bored him. "But one day you will." The finality in his tone sent a chill down her spine. She took a step closer, gripping the edge of his desk so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You had no right," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but filled with something dark and dangerous. Richard tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was an interesting puzzle he had yet to solve. "No." "Right," he repeated, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Sophia, you are my daughter. Your world is decided for you. There are rules, and I make them." She shook her head, refusing to accept his words. "That's not fair." His smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Fairness is for people who don't have power," he said simply. "And you, my dear, were born to be powerful." He placed his drink down with a quiet clink and met her gaze with unsettling calm. "You'll understand when you're older." Sophia wanted to scream, to throw something, to force him to admit what he had done, but she knew him too well. Richard Lancaster did not confess. He did not apologize. He simply erased problems and moved on, and tonight, Noah had been a problem. She turned on her heel, ignoring the way her father's chuckle followed her out of the room. She would find Noah. She would fix this. She ran to the park as fast as her legs could carry her, the breath burning in her lungs. It was empty. No trace of him, no sign that he had ever been there. The bench where they always sat together was undisturbed, the space between the broken swing sets eerily still. She clenched her fists, forcing herself not to cry. Noah was stubborn. He wouldn't just leave without saying something unless he had no choice. Her eyes darted around, searching, desperate for anything, and then she saw it. A crumpled piece of paper wedged between the slats of the bench. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it free, smoothing it out with careful hands. The handwriting was uneven, hurried, as if it had been written in a rush. The words sent a fresh wave of panic through her chest. "I had no choice. Forgive me." Her throat tightened, and for the first time that night, fear replaced her anger. This wasn't just her father scaring Noah away. This was something else, something worse. Noah had been forced to leave, and deep in her gut, Sophia knew that wherever he wasn't safe. Sophia walked through the streets with a single purpose, her steps steady, her gaze sharp. The city had grown around her in ways she hadn't noticed when she was younger, but now, at 17, she saw it for what it was. A machine that consumed people like Noah and never looked back. She had spent years chasing stories, exposing the cracks in the world her father controlled, but every article, every fight was just a distraction from the truth. She was still searching for him. Every missing child she wrote about was Noah. Every abandoned boy with nowhere to go was him. It had become an obsession, one she had long stopped trying to justify. She had promised herself she wouldn't stop, not until she had answers, and tonight she was closer than she had ever been. She had spent the last 3 weeks buried in police reports, missing persons files, and forgotten news clippings. It was always the same pattern. Poor kids, no connections, no follow-up. But something had shifted. There was a pattern she hadn't seen before, a trail that had taken her deep into the city's underbelly. She had talked to former shelter workers, people who had seen things but were too afraid to speak. They told her the same story. Someone was taking kids off the streets, and no one was asking questions. Some vanished without a trace. Others turned up months later, hollow-eyed and changed, refusing to say what had happened to them. Sophia had chased every lead, desperate for something solid, but nothing had prepared her for what she found next. The name was buried in an old database, a record so insignificant it had nearly gone unnoticed. Noah Williams. The moment she saw it, the world around her faded. It was him. It had to be. Her hands trembled as she read through the brief note attached to his. A name, last seen near East End docks, refused assistance, disappeared shortly after. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough, but it was proof that he was alive, or at least that he had been. Her mind raced, piecing together the fragments. The docks, a place where people disappeared, where no one asked questions. If Noah had been there, if he had been seen, then she had to go. She had to see it for herself. Her breath was uneven as she stuffed the files into her bag and stepped into the night. The city blurred around her, neon lights reflecting off the wet pavement, but she didn't care. The docks were on the other side of town, past the districts she knew, past the places where people like her were supposed to be. But she had long stopped caring about where she was supposed to belong. If Noah was out there, she would find him, no matter what it took. The taxi ride felt like it lasted hours. Her fingers drummed against her thigh, her mind racing with possibilities. Had he left? Had he been taken? Was he running from something bigger than either of them? She had no answers, only questions that threatened to drown her. When the car finally pulled up to the docks, she stepped out without hesitation. The air was thick with the scent of salt and rust, the kind of place that swallowed people whole. But she wasn't afraid. She had been waiting for this moment for 7 years. She wasn't going to stop now. She moved through the empty streets, her eyes scanning every shadow, every alley, looking for a sign. The shelters had said Noah had refused help. That wasn't surprising. He had never trusted anyone, not even her. But why here? Why stay close to the city when he knew the danger? Her heart pounded as she reached the water's edge, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. There had to be something, a clue, a trail. And then, just as she was about to turn back, she saw it. A message, hastily scrawled on the side of an old shipping crate, barely visible under the dim streetlights. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her blood turn to ice. Stop looking, it's not looking. It's safe. Her breath hitched, her mind racing. It was him. It had to be. Noah had left this message knowing she would come, knowing she wouldn't stop. But instead of comfort, it filled her with something colder, something sharper. If he didn't want to be found, then the question wasn't just where he had gone, it was who was keeping him hidden. Sophia's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her heart pounding as she reread the search results for the 5th time. Noah Williams. The name was there, but nothing about it made sense. She had expected to find records, old school registrations, maybe even a few scattered mentions in hospital databases. But instead she found next to nothing. No childhood records, no university history, no internship listings. The only thing that appeared was a vague employment record at St. Augustine's Medical Center. A doctor. Noah had become a doctor. But how? She leaned back, pressing her hands against her temples, trying to piece it together. 7 years ago, he had been a street kid with nothing. No birth certificate, no legal identity, no money. Even if someone had helped him, there should have been a trace, a scholarship, a sponsorship, anything that explained how a boy who had spent his life running had suddenly surfaced as a doctor at one of the most exclusive hospitals in the city. But there was nothing, no residency records, no past employment, just his name on a staff list, like he had materialized out of thin air. She clicked on the hospital's official website, scanning through the staff directory. Most of the doctors had professional headshots, lists of accomplishments, research articles attached to their profiles. But Noah's entry was different. There was no picture, no detailed biography, just his name under the emergency medicine department. It was as if whoever had put him there didn't want anyone asking questions. Her stomach tightened. Someone had erased his past. Or worse, someone had created a new one. Her mind raced through the possibilities. If Noah had resurfaced in the medical world, why was he hiding? Had he been forced into this? Was someone controlling him? Or had he willingly disappeared, burying the boy he once was beneath a new identity? The thought made her hands curl into fists. She had spent 7 years looking for him, convinced that he had been taken, that he needed help. But what if he had chosen to vanish? What if he didn't want to be found? The thought didn't stop her. It only made her more determined. She grabbed her coat, shoving her notebook into her bag before heading for the door. The hospital wasn't far, less than a 20-minute ride across town. If Noah was really there, if this wasn't just some elaborate mistake, she needed to see it for herself. She needed to see him for herself. The drive felt endless. Every red light, Every moment stuck in traffic made her pulse quicken, her grip tightening around the strap of her bag. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, what she would say, how he would react, if he would even recognize her after all these years. But now that she was close, an unsettling thought crept in. What if this wasn't Noah? What if she walked into that hospital and found a stranger with his name? Would she be relieved? Or would that be worse than never finding him at all? The cab pulled up to St. Augustine's Medical Center, its grand glass-paneled entrance glowing under the city lights. It was a place for the elite, where only the best worked, where powerful families came for private treatments. Noah didn't belong here, at least not the Noah she had known. She stepped out, her legs unsteady, but she forced herself forward. She wasn't turning back now. Inside, the hospital was quiet but efficient, nurses and doctors moving with purpose. She approached the front desk, swallowing the lump in her throat as she forced herself to speak. "I'm looking in for Dr. Noah Williams," she said, keeping her voice even. The receptionist barely glanced at her, typing something into the system before shaking her head. "Dr. Williams isn't seeing visitors." The response was too quick, too final. Sophia's pulse spiked. "I just need to confirm he works here," she pressed. I'm sorry," the receptionist interrupted, her tone firm. "Dr. Williams doesn't take personal visitors." Something was wrong. She stepped back, her mind racing. Noah was here, but he wasn't just hiding from her. He was being hidden. And now, more than ever, she needed to know why. Sophia barely had time to react before the force of the crash sent her body forward. The seatbelt snapped against her chest, her head whipping to the side as the world around her twisted into chaos. The impact was violent. Metal grinding against metal, the sharp snap of breaking glass, the jarring force that left her breathless. Pain flared through her skull as the car spun, her body helpless against the momentum. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it ended. The silence was worse than the crash. Her limbs felt heavy, her vision blurred, darkness creeping into the edges of her consciousness. She tried to move, tried to think, but nothing responded. There was only the distant echo of voices, the dim awareness of movement, and the slow, inevitable pull of unconsciousness swallowing her whole. The world came back in flashes, hands moving her body, urgent voices, the cold press of something against her skin. Words filtered in, sharp and clinical, but they made no sense. Female, 17, severe head trauma, possible concussion, BP dropping. Move her to trauma 1. She wanted to speak, to tell them she was awake, but her body refused to obey. Her eyelids fluttered, too heavy to lift, her thoughts a scattered mess of fear and confusion. Where was she? What had happened? She reached for memory, but it slipped through her fingers like water. Then, without warning, everything vanished again, dragging her back into darkness. Noah Williams stepped into the emergency, the room, his focus sharp, his movements practiced. He had spent years training for this, learning how to handle chaos, how to keep his emotions buried beneath logic and skill. Patients came in, and he saved them. That was all that mattered. But the moment his eyes landed on the girl being wheeled in, everything inside him came to a screeching halt. His breath caught in his throat, his pulse hammering violently. Sophia. The name crashed through him, shattering the wall he had spent 7 years building. He didn't move. He couldn't. His mind rebelled against the sight in front of him, refusing to believe it. Sophia Lancaster, the girl he had sworn he would never see again, was unconscious on a stretcher, her skin pale, blood trailing from a cut on her forehead. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his training warring with the memories slamming into him all at once. She was older, but she was still her. The girl who had once looked at him like he was more than just another forgotten street kid. The girl who had defied her father, who had fought for him, who had never stopped searching. Dr. Williams? The nurse's voice snapped him back to reality. He forced himself to move, his hands steady as he stepped forward. What happened? His voice was calm, controlled, betraying nothing of the storm raging inside him. The paramedic at her side didn't notice the way his grip tightened on the edge of the gurney. "Car accident," the man reported. "Side impact. She hit her head. Impossible concussion, but no spinal injuries. BP is unstable." Noah nodded, forcing himself to breathe, to compartmentalize. She was just another patient. He had to treat her like any other patient. But when he reached for her wrist, checking her pulse, something inside him cracked. She was real, warm, alive. He had spent years convincing himself that she belonged to a past he had buried, but now she was here, unconscious and vulnerable, and he was the one meant to save her. His fingers hesitated for only a second before he pulled away, snapping orders to the team around him. "Let's get her. Let's get stabilized," he said, forcing steel into his voice. "Move her to Trauma 1. They obeyed without question, wheeling her toward the treatment room. But Noah remained frozen for a fraction longer, staring at the girl who had once been his entire world. Inside the trauma room, the atmosphere was controlled urgency. Monitors beeped, nurses worked efficiently, and Noah forced himself into motion. He examined her with a clinical eye, assessing her injuries, pushing back the memories, clawing at the edges of his mind. He had seen worse. He had treated worse. She would be fine. But then her fingers twitched. A quiet sound escaped her lips, barely more than a breath. Noah's throat tightened. His hands paused over her IV. She was waking up. His pulse pounded, but his face remained blank. He had disappeared for a reason. He had spent years making sure their worlds never collided again. But now, fate had made the choice for him. He leaned in slightly, his voice quieter than it should have been, rougher than he intended. "Sophia." It wasn't medical protocol. It wasn't logical. But it didn't matter. The name slipped out before he could stop it. Her eyelids fluttered. And in that moment, as she stirred beneath his hands, Noah knew one thing with absolute certainty. Everything was about to change. Sophia's body felt like it was made of lead, weighed down by exhaustion, pain, and something deeper, something she couldn't yet name. Consciousness came in fragments, blurry and disjointed, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. A dull throbbing pounded at the back of her skull, spreading through her limbs, settling deep into her bones. She tried to move, but her body protested, the effort sending a sharp sting through her ribs. Something was wrong. She wasn't in her car. She wasn't on the road. A sterile smell filled her nose, and a distant beeping reached her ears, steady and rhythmic. A hospital. She was in a hospital. The realization cut through the fog in her mind, dragging her further into awareness, and with it came the first true sensation of fear. She forced her eyes open, blinking against the harsh light, her vision swimming before slowly sharpening. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar. White, cold, impersonal. She turned her head slightly, her breath hitching as the room came into focus. Machines surrounded her, wires connecting her to monitors, an IV needle taped to her wrist. Her body felt restrained, heavy, like it wasn't entirely her own. She tried to speak, to call out, but her throat was dry, her voice barely more than a whisper. That was when she felt it, a presence. Someone else was in the room. A shadow near the far wall, still, silent, watching. Her pulse spiked, the beeping of the monitor betraying her growing awareness. Slowly, carefully, she turned her head, her breath catching in her throat at the sight before her. A man stood near the corner of the room, his body tense, his posture rigid. He wasn't a doctor, wasn't dressed like the nurses who had flitted in and out of her hazy dreams. He was taller than she remembered. Broader, his frame lean but strong. His hands were curled into fists at his sides, and though he wasn't looking directly at her, there was something unmistakable in his presence. A weight, a familiarity. And then, like a spark catching flame, the truth struck her. Noah, the world around her, disappeared. The pain, the machines, the hospital walls, they all faded into nothing as her gaze locked onto his face. 7 years. 7 years of searching, of questions without answers, of chasing a ghost that had vanished without a trace. And now, here he was, standing in front of her. Real. The boy she had lost had become a man, and yet in an instant she knew. It was him. His features had sharpened, his expression colder, but those eyes, they were the same. Dark, intense, unreadable. He had once been her best friend, the boy who had taught her what it meant to care about something real. The boy who had disappeared, leaving nothing but a single note behind. She tried to speak, but no words came. A lump formed in her throat, her fingers twitching weakly against the bedsheets. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, rehearsed what she would say if she ever found him again. But now that he was here, nothing felt right. The silence between them stretched, heavy with everything left unsaid, everything they had lost. His eyes flickered briefly, something unreadable flashing across his face, something raw, something almost hesitant. And for a second, she thought he might say something. But then, just as quickly, the moment passed. Her lips parted, her voice barely more than a breath. "Is it you?" The words felt small, fragile, a whisper that carried 7 years of longing, of hurt, of desperate hope. She saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers twitched as if the question had struck something deep inside him. But he didn't answer. He didn't move. He just stood there, his presence a contradiction, both familiar and impossibly distant. And then, without a word, he turned away. His movements were precise, controlled, almost mechanical, like he had already decided this was how it would end. Sophia felt the breath leave her lungs as she watched him walk toward the door, her heart pounding in protest. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to happen. This wasn't how their reunion was meant to be. But her body refused to move, the weight of her injuries, keeping her pinned in place as he reached for the door handle. The sound of the door clicking shut was deafening. The absence of his presence hit her like a punch to the gut, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. Sophia lay there, staring at the empty space he had left behind, her chest tightening with something dangerously close to grief. He was here, and then he was gone, just like before. Sophia gritted her teeth as she forced herself to sit up, ignoring the sharp pain that shot through her ribs. Her entire body protested, but she didn't care. She had spent 7 years chasing a ghost, and now that he was standing in front of her, she wasn't going to let him disappear again. Noah stood near the door, his posture rigid, his jaw set in a way that made it clear he wanted to be anywhere but here. He wouldn't look at her, not really. His eyes flickered toward her only when necessary, calculated and distant, like she was a patient, not someone he had once known. That was the sign. The Noah she had known never avoided her gaze. She took a shaky breath, gripping the thin hospital blanket between her fingers. "You just walked away," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. She wasn't asking. She was stating a fact, a truth that neither of them could deny. "You saw me, and you left." Noah didn't react at first. He remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable, the weight of his presence suffocating in its restraint. Then, with practiced indifference, he exhaled and crossed his arms. "You shouldn't be here," he said flatly, as if her existence in his hospital, was an inconvenience, as if she was the one who had done something wrong. Sophia let out a dry, humorless laugh, the anger bubbling beneath her skin barely contained. "Really? That's all you have to say?" She shook her head, studying him the way she would an uncooperative source. During an interview, she was good at reading people now. Years of journalism had sharpened her instincts, made her see things others missed. And what she saw in Noah was unsettling. He wasn't just hiding something, he was burying it. Every word, every movement, every calculated breath was controlled, carefully placed to keep her at a distance. This wasn't the boy she had known. This wasn't the Noah who had once stolen bread just so she wouldn't go hungry, who had looked at her like she was the only person in the world who truly saw him. This man was cold. "You changed," she said finally, watching for any flicker of emotion, any sign that the person she had known was still in there. But he gave her nothing. No denial, no confirmation, just an empty stare, as if he were assessing her now, weighing how much of a problem she would be. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He wasn't going to let her in, not without a fight. "People do that," he replied, his tone indifferent, as if the last 7 years had been nothing more than an inevitable shift in time. He turned slightly, his hand reaching for the door handle again, and something inside her snapped. She refused to. Let him leave. Not like this. "Why did you run?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the space between them. The words hung in the air, heavier than she had intended, but she didn't take them back. If he thought she was just going to let this go, he had forgotten who she was. Noah finally looked at her, then really looked at her, and for the briefest moment, something flickered in his expression. It was gone as quickly as it came, buried beneath the layers of indifference he had built around himself. But she had seen it, a crack, a hesitation, a reminder that the boy she had lost wasn't completely gone. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharp, calculating. Then he spoke. "It wasn't my choice." The words were quiet, but they hit her harder than any scream could have. Sophia's breath caught, her mind racing, dissecting the meaning behind them. Not his choice. The weight of those 3 words sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't his choice to leave. It wasn't his decision to disappear, which meant someone had made it for him. Her grip on the blanket tightened. Richard, her father. The thought made bile rise in her throat, memories of his cruel smirk flashing through her mind. He had always been too calm, too convinced that she would never find Noah. Had he known where Noah was this entire time? Had he done something to make him disappear? She wanted to ask, wanted to push further, to make Noah tell her everything. But the moment had already passed. He stepped back, his face returning to its emotionless mask. "Go home, Sophia," he said, his voice lower now, almost tired. "You're not supposed to be here." And then, before she could say another word, before she could stop him, he walked out. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the second time in one night, Sophia felt like she had lost him all over again. But this time, she wasn't a child waiting in an empty park. This time, she was going to find the truth. Sophia's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her breath shallow as she reread the transaction records for the 3rd time. The numbers blurred together, but one name remained clear, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. Richard Lancaster, her father, the man who had spent years telling her that Noah was gone, that he had vanished like all lost souls do, had been funding him all along. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the details. Anonymous payments, tuition covered in full, institutional fees wiped clean before they could even be recorded. It had all been orchestrated, every step of Noah's transformation from a nameless street kid into a doctor at one of the most elite hospitals in the city. Not by fate, not by luck, by her father. The realization sent a cold chill through her, tightening around her ribs like a vice. She leaned back, rubbing her temple as her mind raced. Through the implications, for 7 years, she had lived with the grief of losing Noah, with the frustration of searching for someone who had become a ghost. And all this time, her father had known. He hadn't erased Noah. He had taken him, reshaped him, controlled him. But why? What possible reason could Richard Lancaster have for keeping Noah under his thumb, for investing in him when he had spent years, making it clear that he was nothing but an inconvenience? The answer lurked just beneath the surface, dark and suffocating, but she wasn't ready to face it yet. She needed more. She needed to see it with her own eyes. Her fingers moved swiftly, cross-referencing hospital records, medical boards, anything that could give her a direct link between Noah's education and her father's involvement. It was all there, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy, disguised as charitable donations and anonymous sponsors. But the connections were too deliberate, too precise. This wasn't just financial assistance, it was ownership. Noah hadn't escaped the Lancaster family. He had been absorbed into it. The thought made her stomach churn. Had he known? Had he agreed? Or had he been forced? She pushed away from the desk, the chair scraping against the floor as she stood. There was only one way to get the truth. She grabbed her bag and shoved her laptop inside, her pulse pounding. She had spent years believing Noah had been taken from her. Now she realized she had been looking in the wrong places. He hadn't been hiding. He'd been kept exactly where Richard wanted him, and she needed answers now. As she stormed out of her apartment, she dialed the one number she knew would get her results. It rang twice before a smooth, controlled voice answered. "Miss Lancaster." Joseph, her father's most trusted associate, the man who had been cleaning up Richard's messes for as long as she could remember. Sophia didn't bother with pleasantries. "Where is he?" She heard the faintest pause, the barely perceptible shift in breath that told her he knew exactly who she meant. "I'm afraid I don't understand the question," he responded, his voice steady, professional, and utterly false. She clenched her jaw. "Cut the bullshit, Joseph. I know my father funded him. I know he paid for everything, his education, his residency, his entire career. So, I'll ask again, where is Noah?" Silence. A longer pause this time, a confirmation without words, and then, just as she expected, the carefully crafted response. "Miss Lancaster, I strongly advise you to let this go." She felt the weight of the warning settle over her, heavy and suffocating. Not just a refusal, a threat. Her grip tightened around the phone. "Or what?" she challenged, her voice low, controlled, but burning with something dangerously close to rage. "Are you going to make me disappear too?" Joseph let out a quiet sigh, the sound almost pitying. "Miss Lancaster, your father has always done what is best for you. Surely, you understand that by now." The words sent a shiver down her spine, not because of their meaning, but because of their truth. Richard had always shaped her life, just as he had shaped Noah's. But she wasn't a child anymore, and she wasn't afraid of him. She ended the call without another word. Her mind already set. If they thought she would walk away, they had underestimated her. She wasn't a girl begging for scraps of truth anymore. She was a journalist, a fighter, and she was going to tear this empire apart to get Noah back. Sophia's hands tightened into fists as she stared at the screen, the Lancaster Foundation's archives glaring back at her like a puzzle that had been deliberately left unsolved. She had spent hours digging through old records, searching for a connection between her father and Noah, and now she had one, a devastating one. The foundation had been operating for decades, its official purpose to provide financial aid to underprivileged youth who showed promise in academics, medicine, law, and engineering. But the deeper she dug, the more one thing became glaringly obvious. There were no names, no case files, no student profiles, no publicly available lists of recipients, nothing but numbers, until one name did appear, over and over again. Noah Williams. Her breath caught, fingers trembling as she scrolled through the endless pages of anonymous funding records. Years of payments, starting shortly after his disappearance and continuing all the way to the present. College tuition, housing expenses, medical school fees, private mentorships, everything had been covered. Not by scholarships, not by hard-earned grants, but by her father. Richard Lancaster hadn't just kept Noah under his influence, he had owned his entire life, and somehow no one had ever questioned it. The payments were hidden under layers of false donors, laundered through various subsidiaries of the foundation, designed to look like routine charitable contributions. But it wasn't charity, It was control. She pushed back from the desk, pacing the small apartment as she tried to make sense of it. 7 years. 7 years of believing Noah had escaped, that he had vanished beyond her reach, when in reality, he had never been free. The man she had seen in that hospital, the cold, distant stranger who had refused to answer her questions. He hadn't chosen to walk away. He had been placed exactly where her father wanted him. A sickening realization settled in her chest. Noah didn't just owe his career to Richard Lancaster. He was still bound to him. The payments had never stopped, which meant Noah was still under her father's control. Her stomach twisted as she grabbed the printed documents from her desk, flipping through them with increasing urgency. If she was right, then there had to be something more, something that tied Noah directly to Richard now, not just years ago. And then she found it, a receipt dated last month, a direct transfer under a medical research grant listed as a discretionary fund allocated to Dr. Noah Williams for an unspecified project. The amount was staggering, far beyond what any normal hospital would pay their employees for personal research. This wasn't a salary, it was a leash. Sophia's breath came in shallow bursts, her mind racing. Why? Why was her father still funding Noah if he had already shaped him into exactly what he wanted? What was the end game? Was Noah complicit in this? Was he willingly accepting the money, or was this something else? Entirely? She thought back to their last conversation, to the way he had refused to answer her, to the way his expression had darkened when she had asked why he left. It wasn't my choice. The words echoed in her mind, heavier now with the weight of everything she had uncovered. She grabbed her phone, scrolling to Joseph's number, her father's right-hand man, the one who had warned her to let this go, the one who had always known more than he let on. She hesitated, knowing that calling him was a risk, but she was done playing safe. Before she could second-guess herself, she hit dial. The line rang twice before his voice came through, calm and measured as always. "Miss Lancaster," Joseph said smoothly. "I was wondering when you'd call." She clenched her jaw, gripping the phone tighter. "I found the payments," she said without preamble. "I know my father never let Noah go." There was a brief silence, but not the kind that indicated surprise. No, this was something else. A calculated pause, a moment of consideration. Joseph had expected this. "You've been busy," he finally said, voice almost amused. "But you're looking for answers in the wrong places, Miss Lancaster." Sophia's grip tightened. "Don't play games with me, Joseph. If Noah was free, he wouldn't still be taking money from my father. And if my father didn't own him, he wouldn't still be paying." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "So tell me, what exactly does my father have on him?" There was another pause, but this time there was something else in it, a shift, a hesitation. It was small, but Sophia had spent years learning to recognize the weight of unspoken words. Joseph knew. He knew exactly why Noah was still tied to the Lancasters, why he had never truly escaped. And for the first time, she heard something new in his voice, regret. "You should stop digging," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "For your own sake." Sophia exhaled sharply, her chest tightening with frustration. "That's not an answer." "No," Joseph agreed, and she could almost picture the unreadable expression on his face. "But it's the only one you're getting. Walk away, Miss Lancaster." Then the line went dead. Sophia stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, staring at her phone as if it might offer her something more. But the silence that followed was deafening. He wasn't just warning her, he was afraid. And now, more than ever, Sophia knew that whatever had happened to Noah, whatever her father had done, it wasn't just about control. It was something darker, something that had kept Noah in line for 7 years. And now, Sophia had to figure out what it was, before it was too late. Sophia's hands shook as she stared at the piece of paper, the ink scrawled across it, sharp and deliberate. "Don't look back. Some questions don't need answers." The words should have scared her. That was the point of a message like this, wasn't it? A warning, a silent threat designed to make her reconsider, to make her hesitate before she dug any deeper. But all it did was confirm what she already knew. She was getting close. Someone was watching her, tracking her movements, waiting for the exact moment to push her away. But they had underestimated her. Fear had never been enough to stop her before, and it wouldn't stop her now. She crumpled the note in her fist, forcing herself to breathe, forcing herself to steady the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. She had spent years fighting for the truth, for people who didn't have voices, for stories that weren't meant to be told. And this was personal. This wasn't just about Noah anymore. This was about control, about power, about the way her father moved pieces across the board without anyone realizing they were being played. But she saw it now, and the closer she got, the more desperate they would become to keep her away. She glanced at her phone, her fingers hovering over Noah's name. He wouldn't answer. He never did. But he was the only one who could tell her the truth, if he would let himself. She didn't have time to wait. If Noah wasn't going to come to her, she was going to find him. And for that, she needed to stop thinking like a journalist and start thinking like someone who understood how power truly worked. Tracking him wasn't hard. He was careful, but not perfect. St. Augustine's was his anchor, but he wasn't always there. She had followed the financial trails, the unmarked transactions, and they led her to places Noah had no business being. Tonight, she chose one, a building so exclusive that even breathing near it required an invitation. The kind of place where names weren't just names, but legacies. She had spent enough years in her father's world to recognize the type. From a distance, she watched as Noah approached the entrance. He didn't hesitate. He didn't check over his shoulder. He walked through the doors like he belonged there. No security stopped him. No one questioned his presence. That was the most unsettling part. She had always known him as someone who moved through the world like a shadow, who only existed when he chose to be seen. But here, he was part of the machinery, another cog in the system her father had built. And that terrified her more than any anonymous threat ever could. Her pulse pounded as she made her decision. There was no way she was turning back now. If Noah could walk through those doors without resistance, so could she. Keeping her head down, she moved toward the side entrance, her confidence hiding the fact that she had no idea what she was walking into. But she had learned how to blend in. She knew how to become invisible when necessary, and tonight she would not be caught. The inside was pristine, all glass, marble, and quiet wealth. It was a world designed to keep people like Noah out, but somehow he had become part of it. She followed his path, keeping her distance, slipping into the elevator just as the doors were closing. She didn't look up, didn't make eye contact with the other passengers. Her fingers curled into her palm as she steadied her breathing, counting the floors, waiting. The elevator climbed higher, past the standard apartments, past the executive levels, until it reached the private penthouses. When the doors opened, she moved quickly, stepping out before hesitation could take hold. And that's when she saw him, not Noah, Richard Lancaster. Her father stood near the windows, his back to her, but she knew that posture, the way he carried himself like the city itself, bent to his will. And Noah stood in front of him, their expressions unreadable, their body language too controlled. But they knew each other. This wasn't a casual meeting. This had been happening for a long time. Sophia pressed herself into the shadows, her breath shallow. Her father hadn't lost Noah. He had never even tried. He had been shaping him. And now, for the first time, Sophia had to face the truth. Noah was no longer just someone who had escaped her father's grasp. He had become part of it. Sophia stepped forward, her pulse hammering in her ears, as she crossed the threshold into the luxurious penthouse. Her father's world unfolding in front of her, like a stage set for a play she was never meant to see. The weight of realization pressed against her chest, heavy and suffocating, but she kept moving, Richard Lancaster and Noah Williams standing together. It was a sight that didn't make sense. Two men who should have never been in the same room, much less bound by something she didn't yet understand. Richard turned first, his expression effortlessly composed. But Noah didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised to see her. He didn't even look particularly interested. She clenched her jaw, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. "Tell me I'm wrong." Her voice was steady, but the fire inside her was anything but controlled. "Tell me you haven't been working for him, that this isn't what it looks like." She wanted him to deny it, to laugh at the absurdity of the accusation. She wanted the Noah she had spent years searching for to look at her and tell her this wasn't real. But he didn't. He just tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was the one who had failed to understand. Richard exhaled slowly, setting down his drink with the kind of patience that sent a chill down her spine. "You always had a habit of looking for things you weren't meant to find, Sophia." His voice was smooth even, too even, like he was amused by this, like none of it was new to him. But she ignored him, her attention locked onto Noah, searching for something, anything that resembled the boy she had known. "Say something," she pressed, her voice sharper now, raw with frustration. "Tell me why you're standing here with him instead of telling me the truth." Noah's lips curled into a faint, unreadable smile. "What truth do you want, Sophia?" His voice was calm, unaffected, as if none of this mattered, as if she didn't matter. "You already know what happened." He took a step toward her, his movements precise, measured, as if he were talking to someone who had just woken up to a reality she refused to accept. "Your father paid for my education. He made sure I had every opportunity I needed to succeed." Another step. "And in return, I agreed to certain terms." He stopped just short of her, close enough for her to see the flicker of something deeper in his eyes, something carefully buried beneath the mask he had perfected. Sophia's chest tightened, her breath coming too fast, too shallow. "Terms," she repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "What did he make you do, Noah?" She needed to hear it. She needed him to say it, to admit that this was more than just an agreement, that this was a deal made in blood. But Noah didn't answer. Instead, Richard did. "I gave him what no one else would," Richard said smoothly, stepping forward like a king surveying his empire. "A future, a name, a life." His eyes flicked to Noah, something almost possessive, in the way he regarded him. "And in return, he ensured that my investments were protected." He let the words settle, giving her time to absorb them before delivering the final blow. "Including you." Sophia's stomach twisted violently. "What?" The word barely left her lips, a whisper drowned beneath the weight of what he was implying. She turned to Noah, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Is that true?" He didn't move, didn't react, didn't deny it. For the first time since she had walked into this room, fear crawled up her spine. Not fear of Richard, not fear of whatever game was being played here, but fear that the Noah she had loved was gone, that the boy who had once stolen food just to make sure she had something to eat had been erased, replaced by someone who belonged to this world, who belonged to her father. She took a step back, shaking her head. "You always knew, didn't you?" Her voice cracked and she hated it, hated how small it sounded. "You were never free. You were never trying to escape." She exhaled sharply, her nails digging into her palms. "You've been working for him this whole time." Noah finally moved, but not the way she expected. He let out a soft breath, almost like a laugh, shaking his head slightly before smiling. But it wasn't amusement. It wasn't joy. It was something colder, something that made her chest tighten with an ache she couldn't name. "Not everything is as simple as you want it to be, Sophia." His voice was quiet, almost gentle, and that made it so much worse. She stepped closer, her heart hammering. "Then explain it to me." Noah studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flashing across his face. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He turned away from her, glancing at Richard before exhaling through his Nose, a sound that felt almost like resignation. "She doesn't stop," he murmured, as if speaking to himself. Richard let out a quiet sigh, looking almost bored. "She never has." He gestured lazily toward the door. "Take care of it." Sophia felt the breath leave her lungs as Noah turned back to her. This was it. This was the moment. He could tell her the truth. He could let her in. He could choose to be something more than whatever this had turned him into. Instead, he smiled. "Go home, Sophia." Then he walked past her without another word, leaving her standing there with the wreckage of everything she thought she knew. Sophia slammed the folder onto Noah's desk, the force of it scattering documents across the polished surface. Her breath was ragged, fury and disbelief twisting inside her like a storm she could no longer contain. She had spent days following every lead, nights poring over hidden transactions and classified reports, digging through the past like an archaeologist desperate to uncover a truth that had been buried beneath lies. And now it was here, in front of her, undeniable, infuriating, devastating. Noah had never escaped. He had never been free. Richard Lancaster hadn't just erased him from her life. He had built him into something else entirely. Sophia's fingers curled into fists at her sides as she glared at the man in front of her, the boy she had once known, the ghost she had spent years chasing. But Noah didn't flinch. He didn't even look surprised. He just sat there watching her, with that same infuriatingly calm expression, like none of this mattered, like she didn't matter. And that was what made her snap. "Say something," she demanded, her voice shaking with rage. "Tell me this isn't what it looks like. Tell me you haven't been working for him this whole time." But Noah just tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes unreadable, his silence louder than any confession could ever be. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, like he was bored by her outburst. "What do you want me to say, Sophia?" His voice was steady, detached, and that only made her blood boil. Hotter. That I didn't know my education was paid for, that I wasn't aware of who was pulling the strings. He let out a quiet, humorless chuckle, shaking his head slightly. That I was just some helpless kid, forced into a deal he never saw coming. His gaze sharpened as it met hers. Something cold, something final, because that would be a lie. The admission hit her like a punch to the gut, knocking the breath from her lungs. He knew. He had known all along. Not just that her father had shaped his future, but that this had never been about giving him a better life. It had been about turning him into something useful, and he had let it happen. She took a step forward, slamming both hands onto the desk, forcing him to look at her. "So, what was the price, Noah?" Her voice was sharp, trembling with the weight of the betrayal sinking into her bones. "What did he take from you in exchange for all of this?" She gestured around the office, at the luxury that surrounded them, at the carefully constructed life that wasn't supposed to be his. "Because don't you dare tell me it was free." He watched her, his expression unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, something she almost missed. A shadow, a hesitation, a crack in the perfect facade he had built. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. "You don't understand, Sophia," he said quietly, his voice almost gentle, and that made it so much worse. Sophia let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Then help me." "Understand," she shot back, her voice breaking at the edges. "Tell me why. Tell me how you can look me in the eye, knowing what he did to you, knowing what he did to us, and still act like this doesn't matter." She took another step, lowering her voice now, trying to push past whatever wall he had built around himself. "He destroyed your life, and you let him." Noah's fingers curled into his palms, his breathing slow, measured, but she had struck something, a nerve, a wound that had never fully healed. Still, when he spoke again, his voice was controlled, his words deliberate. "You think I had a choice?" he asked, his gaze locking onto hers, something sharp behind his eyes. "You think I could have walked away? That if I had run, he wouldn't have found me again?" His voice didn't rise, didn't break, but there was something dangerous underneath it. "You don't know what it was like." "What?" "He did to make sure I stayed exactly where he wanted me." Her chest tightened, frustration clawing at her throat. "Then tell me," she whispered. "Tell me what he made you do." Noah went silent. The air between them stretched, thick with something unspeakable, something that neither of them could name. He didn't look away, he didn't shift, he just stood there, letting the silence fill the space where the truth should have been. Her heart pounded. "Say it," she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper now. "Say it, Noah." And then, finally, he did. "I don't work for Richard Lancaster." The words were slow, precise, like they had been practiced, like he had accepted them long before she had ever asked the question. His eyes never left hers as he finished. "I work with him." Sophia's breath hitched, her stomach plummeting as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath her. She had expected denial, a fight, some sign that he was still in there, but this was worse. This wasn't captivity. It wasn't a trap. It was a choice. Her throat tightened, her vision swimming. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, as if refusing to believe it could make it untrue. "No, you wouldn't." But Noah didn't argue, he didn't explain, he just watched her, and that was when she knew. Noah Williams wasn't trapped, he wasn't being controlled. He had become exactly what Richard Lancaster wanted him to be. Sophia's fingers hovered over her keyboard, her breath coming in sharp, measured bursts. Her article was gone, not edited, not flagged for review, erased. Every document she had compiled, every interview transcript, every financial record linking Richard Lancaster to years of corruption, wiped from existence. She clicked through her folders, searching for backups, but each attempt ended the same way. File not found. The walls of the newsroom felt smaller, the fluorescent lights humming with something oppressive. This wasn't a rejection. This wasn't hesitation. This was deliberate, a carefully executed purge of everything she had worked for. The weight of realization pressed down on her, suffocating and undeniable. Richard had gotten to them first. Her hands curled into fists as she grabbed her phone, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. She dialed Michael's number, her editor, the man who had promised her they would see this through, that the truth mattered more than influence, that no name, no matter how powerful, was above exposure. The call connected. "Sophia," his voice was careful, too careful, like he had been waiting for this moment. "Tell me what the hell is going on," she demanded, her voice sharp with barely contained fury. "My article is gone. Everything I uploaded, every source, every goddamn lead, gone." A pause, a sigh. "Sophia, let it go." She stiffened. "Let it go." The words made her stomach turn. "You don't understand," she shot back, gripping the phone tighter. "I have proof. I have everything. The funding trails, the private meetings, It doesn't matter," Michael interrupted, and the quiet finality in his voice sent a chill through her spine. "This came from the top. We can't run it. No one can." She felt the floor beneath her tilt, her grip on reality slipping. "You're telling me that Richard Lancaster made a few phone calls and suddenly no publication will touch this?" Silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of things unsaid. And then came the final blow. "It's not just the article, Sophia. You're done. The board made their decision this morning. You've been terminated." The words hit like a physical blow. Fired, not suspended, not reassigned. Fired. She blinked, trying to process it, but it didn't make sense. "You're firing me for doing my job?" Her voice wavered, and she hated the way it sounded. Raw, betrayed, helpless. Michael exhaled, his tone softer now, but no less brutal. "I'm telling you that you picked a fight you can't win." She swallowed the lump in her throat, refusing to let the anger become desperation. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice hollow. "I dig too deep. I asked the wrong questions, and now I don't exist." "You made yourself a target," Michael admitted, "and Richard Lancaster doesn't leave loose ends." Sophia ended the call before she could say something she'd regret. Her hands shook as she placed her phone on the desk, her mind racing. No job, no byline, no credibility. It wasn't just that she had been silenced, she was being erased. She opened her email, hoping for some trace of what had happened, but messages were already flooding in. Access revoked, credentials deactivated, colleagues distancing themselves, people she had worked with for years, suddenly couldn't comment on internal matters. It was like watching herself disappear in real time. Her credit cards stopped working within the hour. A visit to her bank revealed her account was frozen, flagged for suspicious activity. She stepped outside, needing air, needing space, but even that all felt suffocating. She wasn't just out of a job, she was out of moves. Richard hadn't blocked her article, he had dismantled her entire life in a matter of hours. This wasn't a warning, this was an execution, and then she saw it. A black car parked across the street, tinted windows, engine running. It had been there for hours, maybe longer, watching, waiting. She had spent years exposing powerful men, unraveling secrets, but this was the first time she truly understood the danger. Her heart pounded as she made her way back inside, forcing herself to think, to focus. If he wanted her to disappear, she already would have. No, this wasn't about elimination. This was about control. And Richard Lancaster didn't play games he hadn't already won. She locked the door behind her, pressing her back against the wood as she exhaled shakily. That was when she saw it. A plain envelope slipped under the door, resting in the dim light of her apartment. Her stomach twisted as she crouched, fingers hesitant as she picked it up. No return address, no name, just an address written on a single sheet of paper. She stared at it, pulse hammering. A trap, a message, a final warning. She had nothing left. No job, no allies, no security. And yet she knew exactly what she was going to do. She was going to show up. Sophia gripped the rusted gate with both hands, pushing it open with effort as the metal groaned in protest. The orphanage loomed before her, a forgotten relic of a past that had been carefully erased, left to decay just like the lives that had once passed through its doors. St. Thomas Children's. Home. The letters were barely legible, chipped away by time and neglect, but she didn't need the sign to tell her what this place was. She already knew. This was where Noah's story began. The real Noah. The one who had existed before Richard Lancaster had taken him and molded him into something else. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, the realization that everything she had ever known about him was a lie. Not just his name, not just his past, his entire existence. She inhaled sharply, pushing forward, stepping over broken glass and dead leaves, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Whoever had sent her here had known exactly what they were doing. They had known she would find something. The entrance doors were heavy, warped with moisture and time, but they gave way beneath her push. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the scent of abandonment clinging to every surface. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, graffiti scrawled over old, faded murals of smiling children, images that felt almost mocking in a place that had clearly been forgotten by the world. Sophia stepped carefully, her boots crunching over debris as she moved deeper inside. Noah had lived here. Once, he had walked these halls, slept in these rooms, and yet there was no record of him anywhere, until now. She ran her fingers over a row of wooden doorframes, her breath catching as she noticed the faint carvings etched into the surface. Initials, dozens of them, children marking their existence in a place that had tried to erase them. Her fingers stopped over two letters at the bottom, nearly invisible beneath the grime and scratches of time. N.W. Her stomach twisted. He had been here. But under that, faintly scratched as if someone had tried to erase it, was another name, one she didn't recognize. She stepped back, exhaling sharply, forcing herself to focus. There was more. There had to be. If someone had gone through the trouble of bringing her here, they had left her a trail to follow. She pressed forward, pushing through a door at the end of the hallway. It swung open. With a loud creak, revealing what had once been an office, papers were strewn across the floor, filing cabinets overturned, chairs left abandoned as if whoever had worked here had left in a hurry. But her eyes landed on a cabinet still intact, still locked, as if it had been deliberately sealed. Away! She wasn't leaving without opening it. Dropping to her knees, she yanked at the rusted handle, pulling with everything she had until the lock snapped and the drawer slid open with a sharp jolt. Files, dozens of them, each one belonging to a child who had passed through these doors. She flipped through them quickly, scanning the names, the brief histories, until her fingers froze over one in particular, Noah Williams. But something was wrong. The name wasn't printed like the others. It had been handwritten, added after the fact, covering something else. Her breath caught as she carefully peeled back the label, revealing the truth beneath it. Noah Williams had never existed. His entire identity had been fabricated, rewritten to fit into a new world, a world Richard Lancaster had chosen for him. The implications hit her like a punch to the gut. He hadn't just disappeared. He had been erased and replaced. A manufactured version of himself, built from nothing, shaped into someone else's vision of who he should be. Her pulse quickened as she flipped through the pages. No birth certificate, no records before the orphanage, no legal existence before the name was changed. Whoever he had been before, whatever his real name was gone. The boy she had known, the one she had spent years searching for, had never been Noah Williams. He had been someone else, someone who had been stripped of his past and given a new one, molded to fit into a carefully crafted role. The weight of the revelation settled heavily on her chest. He hadn't chosen this. He had been rewritten, and if he had let it happen, it was because he had no other choice. Then she saw it, a letter, folded neatly, tucked inside the file, as if waiting for someone to find it. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out. The paper old but intact, the ink slightly smudged, as if written in haste. She unfolded it carefully, her breath catching as she read the first line. "If you're reading this, it means I went too far to come back." Her vision blurred, her chest tightening as she forced herself to keep reading. "I didn't choose this. You need to know that. I didn't ask for this name, for this life, for the things I've done to survive it, but I can't undo it. I can't be the boy I used to be, and I can't let you keep looking for someone who doesn't exist anymore. Forget me, Sophia." The paper slipped from her, fingers drifting to the floor as the truth finally settled, suffocating and absolute. Noah hadn't just disappeared. He had been buried. His real name, his real past, everything that made him who he was, had been carefully erased and replaced with the man he had become. And he had left this letter behind as a warning, a plea, a final goodbye. Her hands curled into fists, a hollow ache spreading through her chest. Forget him? No, she couldn't. She wouldn't. Richard Lancaster may have rewritten Noah's past, but he hadn't destroyed him. Somewhere beneath the mask, beneath the name and the life that had been forced onto him, was the boy she had lost. And she was going to find him, even if it meant tearing down everything in her way. Sophia didn't knock. She didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open with force, stepping into Noah's office like a storm, ready to tear through everything in its path. He was behind his desk, as always, calm, collected, unreadable, as if he hadn't spent the last 7 years living a lie. But this time, she wasn't here to ask questions. She wasn't here to beg him to tell her the truth. She was here to make him face it. He looked up at her, his expression barely shifting, but she caught the faintest flicker of something in his eyes, something that almost looked like resignation. "Sophia," he said, evenly, his voice steady, too steady, as if he had already decided how this conversation would end. She threw the folder onto his desk, the papers spilling out, exposing the truth between them like an open wound. "I know everything," she said, her voice sharp, unwavering. "I know your name isn't real. I know Richard erased you, rebuilt you, shaped you into whatever he needed you to be. and I know you let him." The words were laced with anger, but underneath there was something else. Grief, the loss of the boy she had known, the loss of the person he had once been. Noah's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away, didn't flinch. "And what do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost tired. "That I regret it, that I wish I had fought harder, that I hate who I've become." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Because that won't change anything, Sophia." She shook, her head, her chest tightening. "No, it won't, but at least it would mean you still care." Her voice cracked slightly, but she forced herself to keep going. "Do you even remember who you were before all of this? Before Richard decided you were worth keeping?" Her hands trembled at her sides. "Because I do. I remember the boy who would rather starve than let someone else go hungry. I remember the boy who didn't take orders from anyone. And now you sit here, pretending none of that matters, pretending you had no choice." She stepped closer, refusing to let him hide behind his carefully crafted indifference. "Tell me, Noah, was it worth it?" His fingers curled slightly on the desk, tension rippling through his posture. For the first time, something broke in his expression. A hesitation, a crack in the perfect mask. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. He stood slowly, pushing the chair back, his gaze unreadable as he looked down at her. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice low, steady. "I took the only path that was open to me. I wasn't given options, Sophia. I was given survival." He tilted his head slightly, studying her, and there was something dark in his eyes. Now, something painfully honest. "Would you have rather found my body in an alley somewhere? Because that was the alternative." Her breath caught, her hands curling into fists. "That's bullshit," she shot back, her voice sharp. "You think that's the only way you could have survived? You think Richard Lancaster saved you?" She let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "He didn't save you, Noah. He took you. He took everything that made you who you were, and you let him." Her voice lowered, filled with something raw, something desperate. "And if you think that's survival, then you're already dead." For a moment he didn't speak, didn't move. The weight of her words settled between them, heavy, unshakable. Then, finally, he exhaled. "Maybe I am," he admitted, his voice quieter now, almost too soft. He looked past her for a second, as if seeing something she couldn't, something long buried. And then, as if forcing himself back to the present, he squared his shoulders. "But I'm still standing, and that's more than I ever expected." Sophia swallowed hard, her throat tight, her chest burning with frustration. He was slipping away, retreating into the version of himself that Richard had created, and she was losing him. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, you don't get to do this. You don't get to stand there and act like this was inevitable." She stepped closer, forcing him to meet her gaze. "So tell me, Noah, if you did all of this to survive, if you let him, he'd turn you into whatever he needed you to be, then tell me one thing." Her voice was steady now, each word deliberate, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Are you still Noah Williams?" Noah's breath hitched. The question landed like a blow. His face remained unreadable, his body still, but his fingers twitched at his sides, barely noticeable, except to her, because she saw it. She saw him falter. For the first time since she had walked into this office, since she had forced him to face everything he had buried, he had no answer. The silence stretched between them, suffocating. And then, finally, Noah looked away. He couldn't answer. Sophia moved through the grand ballroom, her pulse hammering in her ears, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on her like a vice. The room was filled with men in tailored suits, women in gowns worth more than most people's salaries, all draped in the quiet arrogance that came with knowing they owned the world. Chandeliers cast a golden glow over the sea of wealth and power, glasses of champagne were raised in calculated toasts, and at the center of it all, standing above them like a god among mortals, was Richard Lancaster. His presence was effortless, his posture that of a king who had never once doubted his rule. Tonight he wasn't just hosting an event, he was making history. Sophia had spent the last 72 hours trying to stop this, exhausting every possible angle, every potential ally. But there was no stopping Richard Lancaster when he had made up his mind. Tonight he would announce his successor, and she knew, God, she knew, that it would be Noah. If Richard called his name, if Noah stepped onto that stage, there would be no turning back. He would be theirs forever. The perfect heir, sculpted from the dirt of the streets and polished into something. Cold, obedient, unstoppable. She scanned the crowd, searching for him, for any sign that he might still be fighting this, but deep down, she already knew the truth. If he hadn't run by now, he never would. Richard lifted his glass, signaling the crowd. A hush fell over the room, the kind of silence that only came from absolute control. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying with ease, every syllable dripping with confidence. "For years I have built something that will outlive all of us, an empire, and an empire needs a ruler." A murmur rippled through the audience. Excitement, bubbling just beneath the surface. They had come for this. They had come to witness the coronation of a king in waiting. Sophia's hands curled into fists at her sides as Richard's gaze swept over the room, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. "Tonight, I introduce you to the man who will lead us into the future." Sophia forced her way closer, pushing past clusters of people murmuring in anticipation. She needed to stop this. She needed to get to Noah before he made the biggest mistake of his life. But then Richard turned slightly, gesturing toward the side of the stage, and everything slowed. Noah Williams. The name echoed through the ballroom, met with polite applause, nods of approval from men who had spent their entire lives deciding the fates of others. This was it. This was the moment Noah chose who he was going to be. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as the crowd shifted, heads turning, eyes searching for him, and then he stepped forward. Noah emerged from the shadows, moving with the kind of confidence that made Sophia's stomach twist painfully. He was unrecognizable in the sharp lines of his tailored suit, his posture flawless, his face an unreadable mask. He looked like he belonged here, like he had never been anything else. Her heart pounded as he made his way toward Richard, each step sealing his fate, each movement solidifying the transformation she had fought so hard to undo. He wasn't hesitating, he wasn't resisting, he was choosing this. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Maybe she had lost him after all. But then he saw her. It was just a flicker, barely a second, but it was enough. His gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he faltered. His steps slowed, his expression wavered, and in that split second she saw something raw, something uncertain. The boy who had once fought to survive, the boy who had once looked at her like she was the only person in the world who mattered. He was still in there, and he was drowning. Sophia didn't think. She moved, she ran, because if there was any chance at all to pull him back from the edge, she would take it, even if it meant destroying everything in her path. Noah took slow, deliberate steps toward the podium, the weight of every decision he had ever made pressing down on his shoulders. The room was utterly silent. Hundreds of powerful figures watching him, waiting for him to take his place beside Richard Lancaster, waiting for him to accept what had been promised, what had been designed for him, the legacy, the control, the power. Richard stood just behind him, a king surveying his chosen heir, his expression one of absolute certainty. And why wouldn't it be? He had spent years shaping this moment, shaping Noah into something he could use. But as Noah's fingers curled around the edge of the podium, as he glanced down at the microphone, already switched on, something inside him cracked. He lifted his gaze, scanning the room, seeing not just the wealth, not just the prestige, but the machine that had swallowed him whole. These men had decided fates with handshakes and whispers, had erased lives with the stroke of a pen, and now they were waiting for him to become one of them. His eyes found Sophia in the crowd, standing near the back, fists clenched, pleading with him in silence. She wasn't moving. She wasn't running. She was simply watching, waiting for him to make a choice, his choice. For the first time in years, he realized, this was it, the moment he decided who he truly was. Noah inhaled slowly, then turned his gaze to Richard, his mentor, his captor, his creator, the man who had taken him from nothing and given him everything except a choice. Richard was composed, as always, but there was something in his expression now, something sharper, something warning. Don't ruin this. Noah could hear it in the way Richard's fingers tapped once against the side of his glass, could see it in the slight narrowing of his eyes. Stay in line, play your part, say what you're supposed to say. For years, Noah had done just that, but not tonight. He leaned slightly forward, his voice steady as he spoke into the microphone. Thank you, Richard. The room remained silent, a collective breath held in anticipation. And thank you all for being here tonight. He let his gaze drift across the crowd, lingering for just a second too long on Sophia before he continued. I've spent my life being told who I am, being given a name, a purpose, a place in this world. Richard Lancaster ensured that I had opportunities that no one else did. He ensured that I became someone powerful, someone untouchable. There was a murmur in the audience, subtle nods of approval. But then Noah took a step back from the podium, shaking his head slightly. But the truth is, I was never supposed to be here. The murmurs grew louder, confused. Glances exchanged between guests. Richard stiffened beside him, his jaw tightening, but he didn't speak, not yet. He was waiting, calculating, preparing to salvage whatever this was turning into. But Noah wasn't done. He turned back to the microphone, gripping the edges of the podium, steady, firm, unshaken. Richard Lancaster has spent decades building an empire, one built on power, on money, on control. He exhaled, his voice growing stronger. But the foundation of that empire isn't just business. It isn't just politics. It's people. He let the words settle, let them crawl under the skin of the audience before delivering the final blow. And I am one of those people, one of the many children he took, one of the many he erased. A ripple of unease spread through the room. He saw it happen, the slow unraveling of certainty, the way people suddenly weren't sure if they should still be smiling. Richard's fingers twitched. He was still composed, still the ever-powerful figure that no one dared to question. But Noah could feel the crack forming beneath the surface. He had expected resistance, had prepared himself for the moment Richard would step in, shut him down, turn this into nothing more than a misunderstanding. But he wasn't giving Richard that chance. I was an orphan, Noah continued, his voice unwavering. I had no name, no family, no future. And Richard Lancaster saw that as an opportunity. He took me, just as he took others, and he turned me into someone else. He erased my past. He made me into something useful, something presentable, something marketable. The words hit the room like a gunshot. Some gasped, others glanced nervously at Richard, waiting for his reaction. But Richard didn't move, didn't blink. Not yet. Noah took another breath. Everything I became was because of him, but not out of kindness, not out of generosity, out of necessity, because men like Richard don't invest in people unless they get something in return. He let that sink in, let the truth finally breathe. Then he delivered the final strike. I know where the money comes from, the offshore accounts, the bribes, the names tied to every illegal deal that passed through this room. His gaze shifted, locking onto men who had spent their lives hiding in plain sight. I know how he buys silence, how he owns you. The room erupted. Voices overlapped, some in protest, some in shock. Richard Lancaster had been publicly accused by his own chosen successor. But before he could step in, before the damage could be contained, the doors at the far end of the ballroom burst open. A flood of dark suits, a rush of movement, a single sharp command. FBI! Everyone stay where you are. Noah closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, exhaling as the chaos unfolded around him. It was over. The walls of the empire Richard had built, the one that had shaped Noah from the inside out, were finally starting to crumble. He had given Richard a chance to turn him into something unrecognizable, and now he had taken everything from him. He opened his eyes again, scanning the room, finding Sophia in the sea of moving bodies. She was still there. She had never left, and for the first time in years, Noah finally understood what it meant to be free. Noah stood outside the grand estate that had once felt inescapable, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat as he watched the last remnants of Richard Lancaster's empire fall apart. The police had cleared most of the guests from the ballroom, escorting them into waiting cars, questioning them under the weight of the accusations that had shattered the night. The reporters were already circling like vultures, cameras flashing as the man who had built an empire on silence and control was led away in handcuffs. Richard Lancaster was finished. The untouchable king had finally been dethroned, and yet, as Noah exhaled slowly, watching the scene unfold, he didn't feel victorious. Sophia stood a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching him instead of the chaos. He could feel her gaze on him, waiting for something, a sign that this had been worth it, that he didn't regret the choice he had made. But he wasn't sure he could give her that. He had spent his whole life fighting to survive, clawing his way through every impossible situation, adapting, obeying, outmaneuvering those who had tried to control him. And now he had won. Now the monster who had rewritten his past, dictated his future, stripped him of his identity and shaped him into something useful, was gone. But the scars Richard had left behind, the choices Noah had made to stay alive, those things didn't disappear with an arrest. Those things stayed. He turned to her slowly, taking in the way her face softened just slightly when their eyes met. "It's over," she said, but there was hesitation in her voice, doubt creeping in at the edges. They both knew better. Nothing was ever really over, but he nodded anyway, forcing a small, hollow smile. Yeah, a single word, but it didn't carry the certainty it should have. Sophia let out a quiet breath, glancing past him toward the flashing lights, the crowd of men in suits watching their world collapse around them. "They'll find a way to rebuild," she murmured. "They always do." Noah clenched his jaw, his fingers curling slightly, in his pockets. "Let them try," he said, and this time his voice carried something real, finality. Richard's world had been built on obedience, on loyalty forged through fear and necessity. But Noah had shattered that foundation, had turned the weapon Richard created into something he couldn't control. Whatever the elite tried to do next, whatever replacement they would scramble to find, Noah wouldn't be a part of it. Sophia studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then she took a careful step closer. "And you?" she asked quietly. "What happens now?" That was a question, wasn't it? Noah had spent so many years moving from one fight to the next, one survival to the next, that he had never stopped to consider what happened after. What happened when there was no longer an enemy to outmaneuver, a threat to neutralize? He had spent so much of his life trying to prove he deserved to exist, trying to become something other than a ghost of who he used to be. But now, standing here with the man who had controlled him locked away, he realized he didn't know how to be anything else. "I don't know," he admitted, and it was the most honest thing he had said in years. "I spent my life trying to survive." He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Now I have to figure out how to live." The words tasted foreign, unfamiliar, but real. For the first time in his life, he wasn't being forced down a path someone else had chosen for him. And that thought was terrifying. He felt Sophia's hand slip into his, tentative at first, as if waiting to see if he would pull away. But he didn't. He tightened his grip instead, grounding himself in the one constant that had always been there, her. Sophia's voice was softer now, steadier. "You don't have to figure it out alone. Noah swallowed, his throat tight, the weight of everything pressing against his chest in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to be wanted for who he was, not for what he could do, not for what he could become. His fingers tightened slightly around hers, and when he looked at her, there was something raw in his gaze, something fragile. "I don't know who I am without him," he admitted, "without the fight." Sophia's grip on his hand tightened in response. "Then maybe it's time to stop fighting." Noah let out a quiet, almost bitter laugh. Easier said than done. She didn't argue, didn't try to convince him that it would be simple, because they both knew it wouldn't be. But she also didn't let go. And that, more than anything, made something deep inside him shift. He wasn't sure what came next. He wasn't sure who he would become outside of Richard Lancaster's shadow. But for the first time in his life, he had a choice. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Every story we bring to Whispered Realms is crafted with care to transport you to worlds full of mystery and emotion. If this journey resonated with you, what stood out the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue creating narratives that take you on unforgettable adventures. And there's so much more waiting for you here on the channel, so explore our other videos and uncover more secrets with us. Thank you for being part of Whispered Realms. We'll see you in the next story.